6. From White Chimps to Yankee Doodles. The Irish. In the 19th century, large numbers of white-looking people who were wickedly good dancers came to America. First came the Irish, a notoriously funky people. Long before they arrived in America, the Irish were known as a filthy people wallowing in vice, as a 12th century English writer put it. They live like beasts, do not avoid incest, and have not progressed at all from the habits of pastoral living. The poet Edmund Spenser wrote in 1596 that the Irish lived in the most barbaric and loathy conditions of any people, I think, under heaven. They do use all the beastly behavior that may be. They oppress all men. They spoil as well the subject as the enemy. They steal. They are cruel and bloody, full of revenge and delighting in deadly execution, licentious, swearers and blasphemers, common ravishers of women and murderers of children. British historian Thomas Carlyle visited Ireland in 1849 and found a drunk country fallen down to sleep in the mud. The Irish, he wrote, were a brawling, unreasonable people, a human swinery, and a black, howling babel of superstitious savages. Clergyman Charles Kingsley was similarly shaken by his travels in Ireland. In 1860, he wrote to his wife, "I am haunted by the human chimpanzees I saw along that 100 miles of horrible country. To see white chimpanzees is dreadful. If they were black, one would not see it so much, but their skins, except where tanned by exposure, are as white as ours." 2 years later, the British magazine Punch proclaimed the Irish as the missing link between man and simian. A gulf certainly does appear to yawn between the gorilla and the Negro. The woods and wilds of Africa do not exhibit an example of any intermediate animal. But in this, as in many other cases, philosophers go vainly searching abroad for that which they could readily find if they sought for it at home. A creature manifestly between the gorilla and the Negro is to be met with in some of the lowest districts of London and Liverpool by adventurous explorers. It comes from Ireland, whence it has contrived to migrate. It belongs, in fact, to a tribe of Irish savages, the lowest species of Irish Yahoo. When conversing with its kind, it talks a sort of gibberish. It is, moreover, a climbing animal, and may sometimes be seen ascending a ladder laden with a heart of bricks. Also, in 1862, the ethnologist John Beddoe published his Indexes of Negrescence, which measured the blackness of Europeans. Scoring lowest were the industrious, restrained, and superior Anglo-Saxons. Those with the highest scores were the Celts of Ireland, who Beddoe described in bodily, sensual, and animalistic terms. The Celtic leg and foot is usually well developed, thigh long in proportion, instep high, ankle well shapen and of moderate size. The step is very elastic and rather springing. In the minds of some Americans, the Irish replaced African Americans at the bottom of the social order. The famed diarist George Templeton Strong, for example, wrote that the gorilla is superior to the Celt in muscle and hardly their inferior in a moral sense. Harper's Magazine in 1851 described the Celtic physiognomy as simian-like, with protruding teeth and short, upturned noses. Similarly, the 1871 book New Physiognomy, written by the American phrenologist Samuel Robert Wells, described Irish women as being governed by the lower or animal passions, seeking her chief pleasure from things physical and animal, and unable to see beauty in that which cannot be eaten or used for the gratification of the bodily appetites or passions. The Irish woman is rude, rough, unpolished, ignorant, and brutish. Another proponent of the theory of natural Irish inferiority was James Anthony Froude, a professor of history at Oxford University. He described the Irish country folk as more like squalid apes than human beings. The wild Irish were unstable as water, while the English exemplified order and self-control. The Irish were shiftless, too, widely considered too stupid and lazy for skilled labor. Most of the first large wave of Irish immigrants were hired to dig the canals that underlay the Industrial Revolution. Between 1827 and 1853, when Irish dominated the canal workforce, there were 57 strikes on U.S. and Canadian canals, as well as 93 incidents of labor rioting. Irish workers were known to sabotage equipment or even dynamite canals when they were dissatisfied with their wages or working conditions. In 1842, when Irish workers found none of the jobs that were promised them on the Welland Canal connecting Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, they took matters into their own hands. An estimated 1,000 rioters looted stores, took flour from a local mill, and seized pork from a passing ship. Historians have noted that most of the strikes and rioting by early Irish-American workers were spontaneous and, most importantly, outside the means of respectable American and white protest. More than anything else, writes the historian Noel Ignatieff, they resembled the strikes or rebellions of plantation slaves. There was also widespread reporting by employers of Irish malingering. One American philanthropist claimed that Irish immigrants are content to live together in filth and disorder and enjoy their balls and wakes and frolics without molestation. After visiting a work camp on the Illinois and Michigan Canal, the English traveler and author James Silk Buckingham concluded that the Irish are not merely ignorant and poor, which might be their misfortune rather than their fault, but they are drunken, dirty, indolent, and riotous, so as to be the objects of dislike and fear to all in whose neighborhood they congregate in large numbers. John MacTaggart, a manager of the Rideau Canal, declared the Irish incapable of becoming useful laborers. They were too lazy to make themselves respectable. You cannot get the low Irish to wash their faces, even were you to lay before them ewers of crystal water and scented soap. You cannot get them to dress decently, although you supply them with ready-made clothes. Instead, they will smoke, drink, eat Murphy's, brawl, box, and set the house on fire about their ears, even though you had a sentinel standing over with a fixed gun and bayonet to prevent them. Most canal employers could not keep their Irish workers on the job if they did not supply them with a steady stream of alcohol. On average, Irish canal workers consumed 3 or 4 gills of alcohol during the workday, a total of 12 to 20 ounces. Even many Irish immigrants blamed the poor drunken Irish for their condition. Andrew Leary O'Brien, an Irishman trained for the priesthood, who spent time working on the canals, found a great need for missionary work on the Pennsylvania Canal. There was plenty of liquor on the works. All night you could hear these wild Irish in their bacchanalian revels, fighting, singing, dancing, etc., all hours of the night. This, according to the historian Kirby Miller, was due to the fact that the early Irish immigrants were simply unaccustomed to work practices in their adopted country. Most of the Irish who weren't digging ditches were living in slums. Missionaries who went into the 5 Points, the poorest neighborhood in New York City, believed the Irish there to be so degraded that they dragged down the African Americans around them. When in the presence of Irish, blacks wallowed in filth and idleness, but where the blacks were found by themselves, we generally encountered tidiness and some sincere attempt at industry and honest self-support. One missionary claimed, "The Negroes of the 5 Points are 50% in advance of the Irish as to sobriety and decency." In 1857, a government investigating committee learned from landlords in the 5 Points that, in some of the better class of houses built for the tenantry, Negroes have been preferred as occupants to Irish or German poor. the incentive of possessing comparatively decent quarters appearing to inspire the colored residents with more desire for personal cleanliness and regard for property than is impressed upon the whites of their own condition. Given the status of African Americans in the minds of most whites, this was saying something. Largely in response to the great waves of hard-working Irish immigrants, the American temperance movement grew exponentially in the 1840s and 1850s. Temperance halls were established in every major city, and reformers marched through immigrant neighborhoods shouting at the newcomers to put down their cups. But the Irish were not ready to be good Americans. Temperance halls were set ablaze, sometimes by lone arsonists, but often by volunteer Irish fire companies. These fire companies were often simply fronts for Irish gangs who fought with each other over control of the slums. In Philadelphia, a government investigation of the Irish fire companies reported in 1853, "There is scarcely a single case of riot brought before the courts that has not its origin in the fire companies, their members, or adherents." A few years earlier, the United States Gazette had denounced the fire companies that hinder the city of gains from the residence of capitalists who seek comfort and ease. But more than just wreaking criminal mayhem, the fire companies also defended Irish immigrants from attacks by anti-immigrant gangs and from intrusions by moral reformers. Anti-drink marchers were assaulted in the streets by Irish gangs who were affiliated with or aided by the companies. Asked why the Irish rioted against the temperance movement, one man fresh from a grog shop said, "In this land of liberty, they expected to do as they liked." Between the 1810s and 1850s, when more than 1 million Irish fled poverty and famine and came to the United States, they were frequently referred to as niggers turned inside out, or simply as white niggers. American observers found the cultural similarities between the two groups so strong that even blacks were sometimes called smoked Irish. And in 1864, a Democratic Party campaign document warned, "There is the strongest reason for believing that the first movement toward amalgamation in this country will take place between Irish and Negroes." Indeed, the movement had already begun. Cohabitation with blacks began immediately upon arrival, as the Irish were forced into the poorest neighborhoods in American cities. And there is abundant evidence that cohabitation frequently turned into something more intimate. In New York City in 1834, throngs of native-born whites responded to reports of rampant interracial sex by rampaging through the Sixth Ward, attacking blacks and Irish on the streets, demolishing the St. Philip's African Episcopal Church, and setting fire to black homes, and Irish taverns. A similar pattern of mixing and outrage in Philadelphia caused one missionary to complain of how common it was for an Irish woman to be living with some dirty Negro. In 1847, a census taker among the African American population in Philadelphia expressed his shock at this phenomenon. "My heart is sick, my soul is horror-stricken at what my eyes behold. The greater part of these people live in with the Irish." A Philadelphia grand jury reported in 1853 on the great amount of mixing among Irish and African Americans in the city's poorest district, including in one tavern and lodging house where men and women, blacks and whites by dozens, were huddled together promiscuously, squatting or lying upon the bare floors. In their 1979 study of black Bostonians before the Civil War, Lois Horton and James Horton found a substantial number of whites who lived in black neighborhoods or married across the color line, and that most were Irish. The residential patterns of Boston facilitated personal contact between the poorest, most oppressed groups, increasing the likelihood of both friction and more amiable relationships among individuals. The World, one of New York City's major newspapers, reported in 1867 that no spectacle in our city is more common than the sight of the lower classes of blacks and of whites living together in union, if not in miscegenation. It is a somewhat remarkable fact that, although between an Irishman and a black man an antipathy is presumed to exist, yet between the Irish woman and the Negro there exists a decided affinity. In a majority of cases of miscegenation, the parties are black on one side and Irish on the other. This commingling was most evident in the 5 Points area of the 6th Ward. According to journalist Herbert Asbury, the author of Gangs of New York, the district was occupied, for the most part, by freed Negro slaves and low-class Irish, who crowded indiscriminately into the old rookeries of the Points. A missionary who visited a tenement in the 5 Points reported coming across an old Sambo over his brazier of coals. In the same room, from under a long pile of rags, an Irish woman lifted her tangled mop of a head. "Look here, gentlemen, look at this little codfish." And with this she lifted out from beneath the rags a diminutive mulatto child of a few weeks old, to the great delight of Sambo, who revealed all his ivory. According to the missionary, the fate of the black Irish child would be to have rum its first medicine, theft its first lesson, a prison its first house, and the potter's field its final resting place. The largest tenement in the 5 Points, a building known as the Old Brewery, was a virtual temple of miscegenation. During the period of its greatest renown, writes Asbury, the building housed more than 1,000 men, women, and children, almost equally divided between Irish and Negroes. Most of the rooms in the cellar were occupied by Negroes, many of whom had white wives. But throughout the Old Brewery, miscegenation was an accepted fact. The journalist, George Foster, whose New York by Gaslight provided a first-person account of the 5 Points, noted not only the frequency of Irish-black romantic relations, but also that the Irish women he observed regarded black men as desirable companions and lovers. Once again, America's racial renegades came from the bottom of society. There was some violence between blacks and Irish before the Civil War, but pleasurable activities in addition to sex appear to have been much more common. According to historian Graham Hodges, strikingly little violence occurred between Irish and blacks when the two groups dominated the 6th Ward. Even though interracial lovers, black churches, and abolitionists remained in the ward amidst an escalating Irish population, its residents did not participate in future riots against blacks. Dancing was the principal diversion during the early days of the 5 Points, and scores of dance houses soon appeared on the streets surrounding Paradise Square. The most popular dance hall in the neighborhood was owned by Pete Williams, described as a well-to-do coal-black Negro who has made an immense amount of money from the profits of his dance house. An upper-class visitor to Williams's dance hall was shocked to see that several very handsome mulatto women were in the crowd and a few young men about town mixed up with the blacks. And altogether it was a picture of amalgamation such I had never before seen. A reporter from the New York Chipper agreed that amalgamation at the Orange Street establishment reigned predominant, if we may judge from appearances. The dancing at places like this was, according to middle-class reporters and missionaries in the 5 Points, nearly as bad as sex. Reverend Lewis Pease of the 5 Points House of Industry Orphanage saw this when a band played fast. The spirit of the dance is fully aroused. On flies the fiddle bow, faster and faster. On jingles the tambourine 'gainst head and heels, knee and elbow, and on smash the dancers. The excitement becomes general. Every foot, leg, arm, head, lip, body, all are in motion. Sweat, swear, fiddle, dance, shout, and stamp. Underground in smoke and dust and putrid air. At times, according to George Foster, the dancing was downright orgasmic. all observances of the figure, dancing pattern, is forgotten, and everyone leaps, stamps, screams, and hurrahs on his or her own hook. The dancers, now wild with excitement, leap frantically about like howling dervishes, clasp their partners in their arms, and at length conclude the dance in hot confusion and disorder. Many of the men who first imitated blacks on stage were Irish-American, including such minstrel stars as Dan Emmett, Dan Bryant, Joel Walker Sweeney, and E.P. Christie. And Stephen Foster, the most prominent author of minstrel songs, was the grandson of immigrants from Derry. There were thousands of Irish and Irish-American performers of blackface minstrelsy, writes historian Mick Maloney. The list of Irish-Americans on the minstrel stage goes on and on. To Noel Ignatiev, it is surely no coincidence that so many of the pioneers of blackface minstrelsy were of Irish descent, for the Irish came disproportionately into contact with the people whose speech, music, and dance furnished the basis, however distorted, for the minstrel's art. It is also perhaps no coincidence that, as Constance Rourke put it, the Negro seemed to pick up the Irish musical idiom with facility. One visitor to a black tavern in the Five Points heard a hybrid music. In the Negro melodies you catch a strain of what has been metamorphosed from such Scotch or Irish tune into somewhat of a chiming, jiggish air. Eric Lott has noted, the very instrumentation of minstrel bands followed this pattern. The banjo and jawbone were black, while the fiddle, bones, and tambourine, derived perhaps from an instrument called the bodhrán, were Irish. Some of the most frequently performed minstrel songs overtly compared Irish and black experiences, such as "'Tis Sad to Leave Our Taterland," an ode to Ireland in mock black dialect, Ireland and Virginia, and several Irish nationalist songs sung by Irishmen pretending to be slaves. Moreover, according to Lott, many minstrel skits portrayed the Irish in terms identical to those in which they portrayed blacks. One of the more popular minstrel songs, The Darky's Lament, was written as a parody of the Irish emigrants' lament. Irish minstrels introduced the jig, the reel, and the double to the American public. One visitor to Ireland described the double as consisting in striking the ground very rapidly with the heel and toe, or with the toes of each foot alternately. The perfection of this motion consists, besides its rapidity, in the fury in which it is performed. One of the greatest black dancers in the early United States was an Irishman. Master John Diamond was a featured performer in P.T. Barnum's traveling show. His performances of 4 dances, the Negro Camptown Hornpipe, Old Virginia Breakdown, Smokehouse Dance, and 5 Miles Out of Town Dance, were so good that Barnum invited local dancers to challenge him in competitive Negro breakdown. Diamond, according to one theater manager, could twist his feet and legs while dancing into more fantastic forms than I ever witnessed before or since in any human being. Diamond and his black rival, Master Juba, are widely credited by dance historians as having created the style that became tap dancing. Tap dancing was not the only contribution by the renegade Irish. No matter who you are, you may very well owe much of your vocabulary to the filthy, primitive, and uncivilized Irish Americans of the 19th century. If you ever use or enjoy the terms babe, ballyhoo, bee's knees, bicker, biddy, big shot, billy club, blowhard, boondoggle, booze, boss, brag, brat, brisk, bub, buckaroo, buddy, cantankerous, clout, cockeyed, cute, feud, think, fluke, flunky, freak, gab, galore, gimmick, giggle, goof, grifter, hanker, helter-skelter, humdinger, malarkey, mayhem, moniker, scoot, scram, scrounge, shack, shill, shindig, skedaddle, skidoo, slob, slogan, slop, smithereens, smudge, snap, snazzy, sneak, sneeze, snide, snoot, so long, spick and span, spiel, spree, spunk, squeal, stocky, stool pigeon, stutter, swoon, tantrum, taunt, teeming, throng, twerp, wallop, whiz, yak, or yell, or if you have a beef with a young buck and have to bounce him because he talks a lot of bunk and doesn't mind his own beeswax, refer to the street you live on as your block, or call a town a burg, or a pirate a buccaneer, call excrement caca, are in cahoots with a crony, get knocked on your can, or have your clock cleaned while chucking a football or playing chicken, call a police officer a cop, make a wisecrack, dismiss a crank theory or just feel cranky, play craps, say that a dead person croaked, ditch a job because you were docked pay for being late, duke it out with some dude, finagle a deal that makes you flush with cash, are framed for a crime you did not commit, are a little old-fashioned and like to say by golly or gee whiz, can't stand that gawky and grouchy old geezer who talks gibberish and guzzles beer, complain of hack politicians who take graft, have a hunch that leads to a jackpot, listen to jazz, call someone a jerk for being a prostitute's John, like to visit your favorite joint, refer to a child or a pal as a kid, tell someone kiss my ass, put money in a kitty or on the lamb from the law, lick a man in a fight, see the ugly mug of a mugger who takes your money on a muggy night, pride yourself on being a natty dresser, give someone a noogie, are either nuts or have the nuts to raise the bet, but then get dealt the nuts, hand in a game of poker, have a pet animal or child or project or peeve, hate phonies and young punks and pussies, are proud or ashamed of being queer or just a little quirky, complain about the neighbor's noisy racket or a corrupt business racket, have a rollicking good time, think the promising rookie should be given playing time on the team you root for, call a gullible fool who falls for a scam a sap, shoo away a fly or get the skinny on a shoe-in, skip town, slack off, slug a shot of good Irish whiskey, then smack the bar with the glass and slug a temperance reformer in the smacker, know that many good things come out of the slums, get a square deal, are just a working stiff, create a stink, laugh so hard you're in stitches, are a sucker for swanky stuff, or say uncle. You might have early Irish Americans to thank. Lexicographers have found evidence that working-class Irish Americans either invented these terms, modified them from Gaelic origins, redefined them, or put them into common use. Only their colleagues of the bottom, African Americans, have created as much of the language of the United States. Note: a few critics have contested some of the broader claims made by Daniel Cassidy in How the Irish Invented Slang, the Secret Language of the Crossroads, from which the list was taken. But the sheer volume of the evidence strongly suggests that, at the very least, working-class Irish Americans greatly shaped American vernacular language. The making of the Irish cop. Eric Lott and other scholars have argued that expressions of anti-black racism by Irish Americans, such as lynchings of blacks during the New York City draft riots of 1863, or their invention of the word coon, or the deliberate attempts by some to belittle blacks in minstrel performances, were attempts to hide their resemblance in both class and ethnic terms to blackness. As Noel Ignatieff puts it, while the white skin made the Irish eligible for membership in the white race, it did not guarantee their admission. They had to earn it. A minstrel song written in 1844 after a series of Irish-led riots in Philadelphia noted the beginning of a shift among white-skinned immigrants. "Oh, den the big fish gin to fear. Dey thought the burnin' was too near. Dey called a meetin' to make peace, and make all white folks turn police." One of these white folks was William Bull McMullen of Philadelphia, leader of the Irish-American gang The Killers and its sister fire company, the Moyamensing Hoes. McMullen grew up among the smoked Irish and white niggers of the city's poorest neighborhoods. In the 1840s, he took part in several of the city's riots, including one in which he shot to death an anti-immigrant and was charged with stabbing one policeman and injuring another. To avoid trial, McMullen and other killers enlisted in the army. Soon after being shipped out to the Mexican War, the killers physically overthrew the captain of their unit and replaced him with McMullen. By all accounts, McMullen and his crew became full-fledged Americans in Mexico, serving with discipline and loyalty and fighting so fiercely in the Battle of Mexico City that they were cited for the extremest of bravery. Like many other Irish Americans, McMullen moved immediately from service in the Mexican War to municipal politics. In 1850, he was elected president of the Democratic Party Keystone Club in Philadelphia, where he organized much of the Irish population to vote for a pro-Irish candidate for mayor. The candidate won and promptly named 6 members of the Moyamensing Hose Company to the police force. For his efforts, McMullen was appointed to the Board of Inspectors of Moyamensing Prison. The following year, he was elected alderman, a position that allowed him to fill the Philadelphia police force with Irishmen. The same pattern followed in New York, where in the 19th century the Irish transformed themselves from white niggers into white citizens. The Irish gangs in the city waged a relentless carrot-and-stick campaign to gain power and legitimacy. On the one hand, their riots, arson, and general criminal mayhem forced city officials to greatly expand the police and fire services. And on the other hand, the gang's aggressive political organizing among immigrants, the Irish were known to vote early and often for candidates selected by gang leaders, forced mayors and police chiefs to fill the newly created jobs with Irishmen. In 1840, at the beginning of the great wave of Irish immigration, there were only a handful of Irish police officers on the force. But Mayor Fernando Wood, who was elected with most of the Irish vote in 1855, added 246 positions to the police force and filled half of them with Irishmen. By the end of the year, Irish made up more than 1/4 of the New York City police, and by the end of the century, more than half the city's police and more than 75% of its firefighters were Irish Americans. In addition, Irish were disproportionately represented among prosecutors, judges, and prison guards. Soon, the Irish cop was a stock figure in American culture. Once known as ape-like barbarians, the Irish were now able to show themselves as the most selfless and patriotic civil servants. Throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, Irish-American community leaders waged a remarkably successful campaign of assimilation with the goal, as the Irish newspaper The Boston Pilot put it, to create calm, rational, and respectable Irish Catholics of America. The movement was led at the grassroots by Irish Catholic priests such as Archbishop Dagger John Hughes of New York and Archbishops John Joseph Williams and William Henry O'Connell of Boston, who used the power of the Church and Christian morality to make immigrants adopt the ways of their new country. Kirby Miller, the leading historian of Irish immigrants to North America, notes that Catholic discipline easily merged with American demands. Church teachings, as reflected in sermons and parochial school readers, commanded emigrants and their children to industry, thrift, sobriety, and self-control, habits which would not only prevent spiritual ruin, but also shape good citizens and successful businessmen. Irish priests began the work of disciplining their flock during the canal-building period, when they were hired by employers to shame indolent and unruly workers. When laborers made trouble on the Welland Canal in the winter of 1843 to 1844, a Father McDonough used the whip upon them with his priestly authority, and when Irish diggers put down their shovels in a spontaneous turnout on the Gallops Canal near Ontario, Father James Clark pledged to the managers that any assistance in my power to preserve order among the laborers is at your service. Clark lectured the strikers on their duty to work and, according to one account, convinced them to return to their jobs and become perfectly peaceable. According to Miller, most Irish priests during this period reflected both their church's concerns for order, authority, and spiritual conformity, and their middle-class parents' compatible obsessions with social stability and their children's chastity. They therefore condemned traditional wakes, fairy belief, sexually integrated education, crossroads dancing, and all other practices which threatened either clerical or bourgeois hegemony. This iron morality helped make the post-famine Irish the world's most faithfully practicing and sexually controlled Catholics. But in the process, it crushed many old customs which had given color and vitality to peasant life. In America, the Church's worldview merged seamlessly with a ruthless determination by many Irish immigrants to make themselves one with their new nation. Archbishop Hughes, who did more than anyone to assimilate the New York Irish, insisted that the Catholic Church is a church of discipline. To this end, he cajoled thousands of Irish New Yorkers to join temperance organizations and helped establish the Irish Emigrant Society, which placed immigrants in jobs and then monitored their diligence and commitment to the work ethic. Workers who misbehaved were publicly shamed by the Emigrant Society and their parish priest. Hughes placed an army of nuns in major executive positions, managing hospitals, schools, orphanages, and church societies, where they inculcated, among other teachings, the Marian doctrine. Girls were instructed to not only live chaste lives, but also to ensure the purity of others. The Catholic schools established across the country by Hughes and other Irish priests punished children for using the flash talk that created so much of American slang and insisted on strict adherence to proper and respectable English. By the end of the 19th century, these efforts were apparently successful enough to allow Irish-American newspapers to make bold new claims about Irish biology. Irish racial characteristics had become inherently American. Celts were declared to be naturally hard-working, orderly, loyal, and sexually restrained. The Connecticut Catholic newspaper claimed at the turn of the century that Irish Americans are an exceedingly well-behaved and orderly class of men, rather than the stereotype of idle, slovenly, and often vicious beasts. The Irish actually compare favorably in all that goes to make up good citizenship, and the second generation are intensely American in their instincts. All this moralizing and re-racializing appears to have had some influence on the Irish, who by the end of the 19th century had left the ditches for good. Just one generation after the canals were dug, Irish were proportionately underrepresented in the lowest-paying occupations and overrepresented not only in politics and fire departments, but also in teaching, clerking, bookkeeping, and other white-collar jobs. Irish men were elected mayor of New York in 1880, of Boston in 1884, and of Chicago in 1893. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Rhode Island, Illinois, Massachusetts, and New York elected Irish governors. This was a great accomplishment, to be sure. but at what cost? From jigging to marching. Like Irish Americans as a whole, Patrick Gilmore, Edward Harrigan, and Chauncey Olcott began their careers black and ended them white. Soon after his arrival in Boston, from Galway, in 1849, Patrick Gilmore organized a blackface minstrel troupe called Ordway's Aeolians. 14 years later, while serving in the Union Army, Gilmore took Johnny I Hardly Knew Ya, an Irish anti-war song of a soldier returning from war, blind and limbless, added elements of a Negro spiritual he had heard sung by a black street urchin, dressed it up, gave it a name, and rhymed it into usefulness for a special purpose, suited to the times. It became When Johnny Comes Marching Home Again, one of the great patriotic and often pro-war songs in American history. Gilmore penned several other wartime anthems, including God Save the Union, Coming Home to Abraham, Good News from Home, and John Brown's Body. According to one historian, in terms of creating a positive image in the eyes of Bostonians toward the Irish, no one did it better than Gilmore. The son of Irish immigrants, Edward Harrigan grew up a stone's throw away from the heart of the 5 Points during the heyday of the district's interracial carousing. As a teenager, he learned to play the banjo, the instrument invented by slaves that was the centerpiece of the minstrel stage. In the 1860s, Harrigan moved to San Francisco, where he established himself as a minstrel star, specializing in telling jokes in black dialect. During the 1870s, he moved back to New York and began writing and performing in comic plays depicting life among New York's lower classes, especially the Irish and African Americans. By the 1880s, Harrigan was the most successful playwright and theater producer of his era and had moved the Irish closer to respectability. At his shows, he offered pure fun only, declaring them an alternative to the overtly sexual entertainment in much of variety theater. See Chapter 4. In effect, as one historian puts it, Harrigan broke through the Anglo-Protestant representational hierarchy of ethnic and racial groups by injecting a positive Irish image onto the commercial stage. African-American characters were featured in many of Harrigan's plays, usually as an uncivilized counterpoint to the Irish. The 19th century literary critic William Dean Howells noted that while the Irish had moved out of their primitive state in Harrigan's characterizations, African Americans remained in theirs. All the Irish aspects of life are treated affectionately by this artist, as we might expect from one of his name, but the colored aspects do not fare so well under his touch. Not all the Irish are good Irish, but all the colored people are bad colored people. They are the gloomy, razor-bearing variety, full of short-sighted lies and prompt dishonesties, amusing always, but truculent and tricky, and the sunny sweetness which we all knew in the Negro character is not there. Harrigan drew laughs by poking fun at Irish drinking and brawling, but the overall trajectory of the Irish in his plots was upward into respectability. The main character in Harrigan's most popular series of plays, Dan Mulligan, immigrated from Ireland in 1848, fought in the Civil War, bought a grocery store, and served his community as a selfless politician. Irish characters in Harrigan's plays had gained respectability, but lost their rhythm. Songs written by Harrigan and his partner, David Braham, also a former blackface minstrel, that depicted Irish-American life were usually in the style of a jig, but in a much slowed tempo and set to the regular rhythm of a march. They were intended to evoke melancholy rather than movement. Rhythmic syncopation was reserved for the cakewalk or celebration songs sung by black characters, and were among the classic tunes of the minstrel tradition, including Walking for Dat Cake, Dat Citron Wedding Cake, Massa's Wedding Night, The Old Barn Door, and the Charleston Blues. Like Harrigan, Chauncey Olcott started in show business with burnt cork on his face. The son of an immigrant mother who was raised in a paddy camp along the Erie Canal, Olcott ran away from home several times to join minstrel troupes and became one of the more celebrated blackface performers in the 1870s. But in the 1880s, as the effort got underway to make the Irish respectable by returning them to their imagined roots, Olcott was recruited to perform authentic Irish songs in an operatic bel canto style. According to historian William H.A. Williams, after a visit to Ireland in the 1880s, his Irish accent was good enough to last for hundreds of performances, as Olcott established himself as the reigning Irish tenor in American theater. Olcott specialized in sentimental ballads and melodramatic acting and pioneered a new type of stage Irishman who was utterly respectable and non-funky. Eschewing the excesses of the hard-drinking Paddy, Olcott was a handsome, witty, attractive, yet sentimental hero who was not above shedding a manly tear for mother and motherland. He was a good-humored hero who, while capable of daring do, was more at home singing love songs and lullabies. Olcott wrote the lyrics to several sentimental ballads including My Wild Irish Rose and When Irish Eyes Are Smiling, which came to symbolize the sober, sentimental, chaste, and non-dancing Irish who were invented to replace the white simians of old. Olcott and his associates gave Irish Americans a glorious, albeit fantastic, past upon which to build dignity and respectability. Inoffensive. In 1917, an investigator for the Juvenile Protective Association attended a largely Irish dance at the 30th Ward Woodrow Wilson Club in Chicago. The investigator witnessed a considerable amount of drinking and some kissing and hugging, but nothing unseemly in the dance hall. The dancing, he reported, was inoffensive. The style was modern, a foxtrot, but with a clog effect. This movement away from offensive, sexually suggestive dancing appears to have been widespread. Irish youth were noticeably underrepresented on the floors of the commercial dance palaces that became the rage in the 1910s and 1920s. Many, instead, attended clubs in which only traditional Irish music was played. These clubs were part of the movement led by the Gaelic League, which had branches in all major U.S. cities to rid the American mind of Irish stereotypes and reinvent Irish culture as genteel, placid, and respectable. The League claimed with fury that true Irish dancing was never vulgar, that it was superior in grace, science, modesty, life, and mental effects, and that any dance resembling the fleshpots of Egypt was alien to the Irish people. Branches of the League were instructed to ban the catwalk, the cakewalk, and all foreign monstrosities at their social functions. League members vowed to stop the Irish from practicing pure music hall dancing, an un-Irish style that should not be tolerated. What the Irish were doing in commercial, unregulated dance clubs is buck jumping, a dance associated with Irish sailors and black slaves in America. It is fiercely vigorous, but in its execution there is no attempt at gracefulness, no attempt at positions, of which the old dancing masters told us there were 5. There was little attempt at step. It was simply jigging, or as sometimes called, clog dancing. In Irish clog dancing, the wooden footwear is used by striking the heel or toe against the floor to create percussive, syncopated, offbeat or downbeat rhythms. It was taken up by many African Americans in the 19th century and is the basis of both tap dancing and stepping in black fraternities. Sadly, and ironically, the vigorous jigs and reels denounced by the Gaelic League were, according to Irish dance historian Helen Brennan, the real local traditional dance in the villages of the old country. In their place, wrote John P. Cullinane, another chronicler of Irish dance history, the League instituted a strict, almost regimental approach to the performance of group dances. Prior to that, these dances were performed with more individual, non-prescribed, spontaneous footwork, and were robbed of enjoyment and spontaneity, and becoming regimental in both footwork and hand movements. And so, when traditional Irish bands in the early 20th century, such as the Four Provinces Orchestra in Philadelphia or O'Leary's Irish Minstrels in Boston, played jigs and reels, they played them with a lovely elegance rather than in the ragged and pounding rhythms of the early immigrant taverns. Similar changes were taking place in depictions of the Irish in American popular culture. William H. A. Williams in "'Twas Only an Irishman's Dream," The Image of Ireland and the Irish in American Popular Song Lyrics, 1800 to 1920, finds that the clusters of words referring to the combination of drinking, fighting, dancing, and singing, all part of the stereotype of the stage Irishman, declined from an average of 26% of the songs for the last 2 decades of the 19th century to an average of 8% for the first decades of the new century. Williams concludes, whereas Irish had once signified people who were considered wild, rowdy, and undisciplined, by the turn of the century, the word was beginning to suggest attitudes that were conservative and old-fashioned. The old negative elements that had once accompanied the image of the gregarious, fun-loving Irish were gone. In 1916, a book written by a naturalist named Madison Grant redefined the racial status of immigrants in America and established the racial hierarchy that would guide public policy in the United States for much of the 20th century. The passing of the Great Race, or the racial basis of European history, placed Europeans into 3 distinct races: the Mediterraneans, from southern Europe, the Alpines, from Central Europe, and the Nordics, from northern Europe. The Nordics were the superior race, what Grant called the white man par excellence. The Alpines had some potential for achievement, but would never reach the greatness of the Nordics due to their biological deficiencies. The Mediterraneans were only slightly better than Asians and Africans, and would never rise above a primitive agriculture state. The book argued for the exclusion of non-Nordic races from the United States. As for the Irish, they came to America as ferocious, gorilla-like living specimens of the Neanderthal man, easily recognized by the great upper lip, bridgeless nose, beetling brow, and low-growing hair, and wild and savage aspect. In the first Irish to land in America, one could see that the proportions of the skull which gave rise to this large upper lip, the low forehead, and the supraorbital ridges are clearly Neanderthal characters. The other traits of this Irish type are common to many primitive races. This is the Irishman of caricature, and the type was very frequently in America when the first Irish immigrants came in 1846 and the following years. But lo and behold, an amazing thing happened to the Irish gorilla. It seems, however, to have almost disappeared in this country. In less than 70 years, Irish Americans had vaulted to the very top of the racial scale. Grant saw that in 1916, the Irish are fully as Nordic as the English. They were made up of precisely the same racial elements as those which enter into the composition of the English. 8 years later, when Congress passed the National Origins Act, severely limiting immigration by all non-Nordic people, the Irish were allowed continued free entry. The most famous Irish American during the ascendancy to Nordic status was George M. Cohan, the father of the Broadway musical. Though he was born July 3, 1878, Cohan's parents were so eager to prove their patriotism that they insisted he was born on the 4th of July. By the end of his life, Cohan was such a cultural icon that in 1942, Warner Brothers produced a film dedicated to his life story, Yankee Doodle Dandy. James Cagney, who succeeded Cohen as the most prominent Irish American, won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his performance in the lead role. Both the film and Cohen's life illustrate the fate of Irish American rhythm. When Cohen was still in diapers, he appeared on stage with his parents and sister as The Four Cohens, a touring vaudeville act that presented Irish-black hybrid entertainment. Each show included one authentic Irish act, in which the members of the family dressed in leprechaun outfits and danced a jaunty jig. After a short intermission, they reappeared in the Irish alter ego, with painted faces, as black dancers. As a young man, Cohen appeared frequently in blackface and became one of the country's most skilled performers of tap dance, which was the invention of blacks and Irish in the 5 Points. Cagney, too, was an exceptional tap dancer, having learned to dance on the streets around the Points, a short walk from where he grew up. But Cohen and Cagney became great Americans by merging tap dancing with marching. In the 1900s, Cohen began writing some of America's most enduring patriotic songs, including You're a Grand Old Flag, a march first performed as the finale of his 1906 Broadway hit, George Washington, Jr. During the closing act, which is reenacted at the end of Yankee Doodle Dandy, the lead performer tap-danced solo, then fell in line with a grand, patriotic, military-style 1-2 procession. During World War I, Cohen penned Over There, which became the most popular marching song among U.S. soldiers and, in American popular culture, the theme song for the war. In 1936, President Franklin Roosevelt presented Cohen with the Congressional Gold Medal of Honor for his contributions to World War I morale. In the final scenes of Yankee Doodle Dandy, Cohen receives the medal from Roosevelt in the White House, then joins a military march as it proceeds down Pennsylvania Avenue. This is not to suggest that the Irish-American renegade disappeared entirely. During the dance crazes of the 1910s and 1920s, a few were spotted in the nightclubs. And some even used the occasion of St. Patrick's Day to let loose some of the older, degraded customs. This caused the Brooklyn Tablet, the borough's leading Irish newspaper, to declare in 1915 that the saint would have been the first to repudiate levity and dancing on the eve of the Sabbath, and that Saturday night dances for Catholics are an abomination. In Boston, Archbishop William Henry O'Connell forbade not only the new forms of dancing, but also sexually suggestive literature, immodest dress, cosmetics, card-playing, and degenerate singing. Jazz, the Archbishop rightly pointed out, was a sensuous, luxurious sort of paganism. Perhaps for those reasons, historians of the dance craze have found that the Irish were the least represented on the dance floors of all the major American ethnic groups. The result of this aggressive assimilation are twofold. First, Irish Americans not only shed their status as a race apart from other whites, but are now rarely even considered as ethnics. The second result is what is found in Irish American bars all over the country. Guinness on tap, sports on television, and more fistfights than dancing on the dance floor.